Hi there. Tonight we descend into the underworld, the realm beneath all footsteps, the place every story ends and every whisper lingers. It is a land without sun, paved not in marble or gold, but in shadow and silence, where time does not march. It drips, slow as candle wax down stone walls, and in this endless hush rules Hades, who was not cruel, not fiery, but simply steady, as if eternity itself had chosen a keeper. Before we begin, I'd love to know where you're listening from and what time it is right now. It's always fascinating to see how far our little community stretches across the world, and if there are any myths or fairy tales you'd love to hear in a future episode, drop it in the comments below. Now, let's begin our quiet journey. The underworld, feared, whispered about, never spoken directly by name unless necessary, for to name it was to brush a fingertip against its gates. This kingdom came into being when the three brothers, Zeus, Poseidon, and Hades, cast lots for their inheritance, the sky, the sea, and the silent depths. And of course, it was Hades who drew the realm no one envied, though he accepted it with the grim composure of a man who has discovered that life, or death, is not particularly democratic. Here in the deep, the ground was not soil but echo. The air tasted of stone and ash, and the rivers, ah yes, the rivers. They were not gentle brooks but living boundaries. The Styx, solemn and binding, the Lethe, carrying forgetfulness in every ripple, the Phlegethon, a flame that hissed as if anger itself were liquid, and the Acheron, the river of pain, whose banks were worn smooth by countless feet unwillingly arriving, and across them rode Charon, the ferryman, who was less myth than eternal union of scowl and awe. He accepted a single coin, a humble obol, for passage, and if you lacked it, well, eternity on the wrong bank was your consolation prize. One imagines Charon muttering endlessly under his breath. Souls these days, never the right change, always dripping water everywhere, and none of them sit still in the boat. But what of the entrance itself, guarded by Cerberus, that most loyal of beasts? 3 heads, 3 sets of jaws, 3 pairs of eyes that saw nothing but duty, and probably the occasional fluttering shade that looked suspiciously like a chew toy. Cerberus was less of a killer and more of a doorstop that nobody dared argue with. And yet, the ancients loved to whisper about how even this terrible guardian could be tricked with a simple honey cake, a detail so tender it is almost comical. Imagine spending eternity as the most dreaded beast in existence, only to discover your true weakness is baked goods. In the halls beyond, the shades drifted, thin silhouettes, voices blurred into a murmuring tide. These were not screams of torment, but rather the sighs of a theatre audience when the play has ended and the actors never return. Here kings and shepherds, poets and thieves, stood shoulder to shoulder, levelled into silence. Death in Greek thought was not the punishment of fire, but the democracy of shadows. Everyone was equal at last, which sounds noble, though the shades themselves did not seem particularly thrilled by the arrangement. Among them walked the judges, Rhadamanthus, Minos, Iacchus, once mortal kings, now eternal bureaucrats of morality. They sat at their stone seats with scrolls and ink, no longer wearing crowns, but instead the expression of men who had discovered that even in death, paperwork does not end. And presiding over all of this sat Hades, not horned nor screaming, but quiet, unshakable. His throne was not of blazing gold, but of dark, polished rock. His crown not a dazzling circlet, but the stillness of authority that did not need to shout. The Greeks feared him, yes, but also respected him, so much so that his very name was rarely spoken. Instead, they used titles, the Unseen One, the Silent Ruler, because to speak Hades aloud was to invite his gaze, and nobody in their right mind wanted to discover if he was listening. Yet he was not cruel. Hades was the keeper of order, stern, unyielding, necessary. If Zeus was the sky's lightning, Poseidon the sea's wave, then Hades was the still shadow at the end of all journeys. Imagine for a moment the crossing, the torchlight behind you fading, the oar dipping into black water, each pull carrying you further from warmth and memory. The air cool, the silence immense, the river bank ahead not promising but inevitable. That is the texture of the underworld. It is not fire, it is not endless agony. It is inevitability dressed in stone and river mist. Of course, not every corner was bleak grey. There were regions, the fields of asphodel, where most souls drifted without joy or sorrow. Elysium, the bright meadow reserved for heroes and the especially noble. A vision of endless sunlight where poets claimed music never ceased. And below, Tartarus, deep as nightmare, where the titans groaned in chains and the great criminals of myth found themselves in eternal tasks. Sisyphus straining with his boulder, Tantalus reaching endlessly for water that withdrew at his lips. Punishments not of fire, but of irony, as if the universe itself had a dark sense of humour. Perhaps that is why mortals told these stories by firelight. The crackling wood like distant bones, the taste of wine still on their tongues, children leaning closer in terror and fascination, adults smirking softly when hearing of Sisyphus again, forever failing at his task, because it felt strangely familiar. Haven't we all pushed something uphill, only to watch it roll back down? And so, the underworld was both dread and recognition, fear and reflection, somewhere in the corner of all this. Cerberus gave another heavy sigh, drooling onto the floor, proving yet again that eternity, for both man and beast, is largely about waiting. Persephone, queen of the underworld, was the light stitched into that endless dark. She was not born to shadows, but taken into them. Her abduction by Hades has been told for centuries as both tragedy and union, a tale of flowers and stone. She'd been gathering blossoms in a meadow, laughter bright as bells, when suddenly the ground split, and from its wound rose Hades in his black chariot, iron wheels cutting the air. He seized her with a silence sharper than any cry, and the earth closed above them. For mortals, this was the explanation of seasons. Demeter's grief withered the fields. Persephone's return made them bloom again. For poets, it was a story of contrast, life entwined with death. For Hades himself, it was perhaps simply the first time his throne room felt less hollow. One imagines the palace adjusting to her presence, shadows creeping back respectfully, braziers lit more often, corridors swept a little cleaner. Perhaps even Cerberus wagged one of his three tails, confused but faintly delighted, and Persephone, though sorrowful at first, became not a prisoner, but a queen. She learned to walk the echoing halls without fear. Her footsteps softened the stone. Her laughter, when it returned, gave the shades something to follow with longing. Of course, their marriage was not without its small domestic disagreements. Persephone loved gardens and the underworld, inconveniently had no sun, but she found a way. She planted ghostly blossoms that glowed in the dark, pale petals that shimmered like stars fallen into the soil. Hades, in turn, pretended not to notice when Cerberus trampled them. Here lies the quiet irony of the myth. Mortals saw only the terror of abduction. Yet within the tale, Persephone was no passive shade. She ruled, judged, softened, and endured. Imagine Demeter above, pacing through barren fields, her tears falling as cold rain upon mortals who had no harvest. She was a goddess of fierce love and stubborn bargaining. She stormed Olympus with demands until even Zeus, Lord of Thunder, shifted uneasily in his throne, and thus the compromise was struck. Persephone would spend half the year above and half below, and so the cycle of life and death became not just natural but marital, a rhythm written in the heart of gods. There is a strange comfort in this. Death itself was tempered by love. Even in the deepest halls, flowers returned. But not all who entered the underworld did so quietly. Heroes sometimes came pounding on its gates, with mortal hearts full of hubris. Orpheus with his lyre, Heracles with his muscles, Odysseus with his endless questions, each seeking something, each disturbing the silence that Hades guarded so carefully. Let us linger with Orpheus first. He was a poet who believed music could undo death, and indeed, his lyre sang so sweetly that even the Furies wiped their eyes, and even Hades was moved, granting him permission to lead his beloved Eurydice back to the world of light. But there was one condition. He must not look back until they were free of the shadows, a simple rule, and yet the hardest of all. For what is love, if not the urge to turn, to see, to confirm the presence of the beloved? And so he turned, and she was gone. The underworld has always had this cruel wisdom. It allows hope, but only so much, never enough to escape its gravity. Then came Heracles, hero of brute strength and selective patience. He descended not for love, but for labor, tasked with capturing Cerberus himself. Hades, oddly polite, agreed, on the condition that Heracles use no weapons, only strength. And so Heracles wrestled the great hound, 3 heads snapping, claws raking stone, until even Cerberus seemed to sigh and admit defeat. One imagines Hades watching this spectacle with the bemused weariness of a landlord watching someone rearrange the furniture. Yet he allowed Heracles to succeed, for reasons no tale ever fully explains. Perhaps even rulers of eternity enjoy the occasional absurd show. And Odysseus, ever the curious wanderer, he descended not for love nor conquest, but for knowledge, to speak with the dead, to seek wisdom for his voyage home. And he too found the shades, drifting like smoke, whispering like leaves. He learned what all mortals eventually learn, that the wisdom of the dead is rarely comforting. Achilles himself declared he would rather be a servant among the living than a king among shades, a reminder that glory fades into greyness, and that even the mightiest heroes cannot outrun the stillness of death. This is perhaps the truest power of the underworld. It stripped away illusions, leveled arrogance, reduced all to the same quiet murmur. And yet, there was beauty in it too, for in that democracy of shadows, there was no hunger, no storm, no war, only stillness, which to some might even be peace. Curiously, the ancients often left offerings for Hades and Persephone, not with loud hymns or shining temples, but with quiet libations poured into the earth, a tilt of wine, a crumble of bread offered downwards into the soil. They honoured the gods not with shouts, but with silence, a recognition that some powers do not need to be summoned, for they are always there, waiting. And in that waiting, Cerberus shifted again, his heavy paws echoing across the stones, drool pattering softly like rain, as if to remind us all that eternity is never entirely solemn. But if we pause for a moment on those offerings, the wine poured into the soil, the crumbs vanishing between the roots, we must remember that these gestures were not only symbolic, they were practical. For the Greeks, the earth itself was not simply fertile ground, it was a threshold, a living bridge, and each drop of wine spilled downward was a message, a small note addressed to the palace of Hades, from the mortals above, with respect and a touch of trembling fear. And what did mortals receive in return? Not thunderbolts hurled in pride, not roaring waves crashing onto the shore, but silence. That was the gift of Hades, silence. And perhaps that was the greatest blessing of all, to be left alone by the one power that ruled the end of every journey. From here, we may wander deeper into the neighbourhoods of the underworld, because yes, it was less a pit of fire than an ancient city at night, a city without markets or festivals, but with boulevards of echo and halls of stone, divided carefully into quarters, depending on what sort of shade you were fated to become. The broadest region was the field of asphodel, where the vast majority of souls drifted, neither punished nor rewarded. Picture an endless meadow, not green, not black, but grey, a plain scattered with pale flowers that carried no scent. The shades moved slowly among them, their forms as faint and forgettable as the blossoms themselves. There was no agony here, but no joy either, only a long, thin stretch of existence, like parchment too faded to read. And if you leaned close enough, you could hear the whispers of the shades, not cries, not songs, but fragments of memory, half-remembered lullabies, sentences that never found their endings, all drifting like smoke in a closed chamber. Yet not all the underworld was so muted, for beyond this grey plain lay Elysium, Elysium, the sunlit sanctuary of the noble and the heroic. Here the air shimmered with a light that was not the sun, but something softer, eternal. The grass was green, the sky forever gentle, and music flowed like an endless spring. The Greeks imagined Elysium as the camp of heroes, where Achilles could dance again, where poets sang without pause, where hunger and fatigue were erased from memory. Eternity here was bright, restful, beautiful, though perhaps, if we are honest, a little too much like a holiday resort with no checkout date. Still, for mortals who dreamed of glory, Elysium was the highest hope, the eternal meadow where honour itself never faded. And curiously, even here, Hades himself did not loom over the fields. He was not jealous of joy. He was the administrator of balance. His task was not to smile or frown, but to place each soul in its rightful quarter, like a meticulous archivist who ensures every scroll is laid in the proper niche of eternity. But far below all of this, deeper than the darkest sigh, stretched Tartarus. Tartarus was not merely a prison, it was an abyss, so deep that the poet said, if one were to drop an anvil from the edge of heaven, it would fall for 9 days and 9 nights before striking the floor of Tartarus, a fall long enough to compose a tragedy, or at least a very bleak poem about falling anvils. Here the Titans were bound, colossal figures older than Zeus himself, chained with links of fire and bronze. Their groans were not words, but earthquakes, low and trembling, felt even in the lands of the living. But Tartarus also held those infamous punishments, not flames of torment, but eternal ironies. There was Sisyphus, straining forever to push his boulder uphill, only to watch it roll back down again, each time with the weary inevitability of a poorly balanced amphora. His punishment was not agony, but futility, a cosmic warning from the gods. Careful mortals, ambition without wisdom may just turn your life into a hill with no summit. And Tantalus, neck deep in water beneath branches heavy with fruit, yet whenever he reached, the water drained away, the fruit pulled back, a banquet that mocked him endlessly. Imagine it, eternity at the table, always served, but never tasting a morsel. To the Greeks, who loved their feasts, this was indeed the most exquisite torture, and Ixion, lashed to a wheel that spun endlessly through the void, like a warning about vanity, turned into a carnival ride of misery, and the Danaids, 50 women condemned to fill a bottomless jar with water that would never stay, pouring endlessly, working endlessly. Proof that even eternity has chores. These punishments were all cyclical, repetitive, because nothing terrifies the human heart more than meaningless repetition. The Greeks understood. Agony fades, but futility is eternal. And wandering among these doomed souls were the Erinyes, the Furies, Alecto, Megaera, and Tisiphone, daughters of night itself. Their hair writhed with serpents, their eyes smouldered with cold fire. They were not torment alone, but vengeance made flesh. The Furies moved between worlds, pursuing murderers and oath-breakers who thought they could escape justice. They proved one thing beyond doubt, that even kings in their palaces could not hide from blood spilled unjustly. They were the certainty that guilt, no matter how deeply buried, grows roots. And so the underworld was not only an archive of death, but a tribunal of life, with judges, with punishments, with rewards, a shadow order mirroring the living world's hunger for justice. And if you think about it, it was a strangely fair order. Hades was not a torturer. He did not play with fire or chains for pleasure. He was the keeper, steady, inevitable. And Persephone brought with her the promise of return, that spring would come again, that flowers would rise even after the coldest winter. So the myth was never only a tale of fear, but of balance. Yes, all would walk the halls of shadow, but no one was lost entirely. Even the humblest shepherd, the most forgotten widow, remained a shade, whispering, lingering, and through it all, Cerberus heaved another sigh, his drool tapping against the stone floor like a patient rain, a reminder that even in eternity, the dog still waits by the door, loyal and a little messy, and so Cerberus waits, ever faithful, ever drooling, the sound of his sigh echoing through corridors of stone like a reminder that eternity has its routines. But perhaps it is time to step away from the mythic map itself and listen instead to how mortals, poets and philosophers alike, spoke of this realm. For the underworld was not only a stage for stories of gods and heroes, it was the mirror of human thought, the place where every question about life's end was quietly stored. The first voices we hear are those of the poets, Hesiod and Homer, who describe the land of shades not with fire, but with greyness. In their songs, the souls of men did not scream. They simply drifted, like ash carried on a cold wind. Achilles himself, once the brightest star of the battlefield, admitted to Odysseus that he would rather serve as a slave to a poor man among the living than reign over all the dead. That was the terror for early Greeks, not torture, but reduction, to lose colour, memory, vitality, to become a wisp of what once was. And yet, mortals being mortals, they sought loopholes, ways to make eternity less bleak. This is where philosophy enters. Figures like Plato mused endlessly about the soul, about its weight and worth. In his myths, the underworld was not merely a warehouse of shades, but a sorting ground for reincarnation. Souls judged for their deeds, rewarded or punished, then reborn to try again. Life became a cycle, and death not a wall but a doorway. One of Plato's myths even describes a soldier named who glimpsed the machinery of the afterlife. He saw souls choosing their next lives, some foolishly grasping for crowns, others wisely taking humble forms. It was perhaps a philosophical answer to Sisyphus. If eternity was meaningless repetition, then the wise man's task was to learn from it, to choose better. But philosophy was not enough for the ordinary farmer in the hills of Attica, or the fisherman along the rocky coasts. They wanted not theories, but assurances. And so rose the mysteries of Eleusis. In those secret rites, mortals gathered in sacred darkness, offered their silence, and were told things never written down. For the initiates of Demeter and Persephone, death was not an end, but a passage towards something brighter. The promise whispered in their ears was simple yet immeasurable, that those who shared in the mysteries would have a gentler fate in the underworld. No one ever revealed exactly what was shown in those ceremonies, but the echoes are clear. Torches raised in the dark, a reenactment of Persephone's descent and return, and at the heart of it, hope, the assurance that even in Hades' realm, spring could bloom. For the uninitiated, the afterlife was grey, uncertain, a shadow among shadows. But for those who had walked the sacred path, there was confidence, a quiet smile in the face of death. Imagine for a moment an old woman in Athens pouring a libation, her hands trembling with age, but her heart steady because she had stood in the telesterion at Eleusis, had seen the sacred fire leap in darkness, had heard the priestess whisper of Persephone's return. She would meet death not as a stranger, but as a gatekeeper she already knew by name. Not all agreed, of course. Some philosophers scoffed. Democritus with his atoms declared the soul dissolved into particles. Epicurus said death was nothing to us, for where death is we are not, and where we are, death is not. Clever, reassuring, though one suspects that in the silence of night, even an Epicurean might glance uneasily at the shadows, for despite all their words, the underworld remained inescapable. It pressed against the mind of every Greek, not only in temples and philosophies, but in the simplest of objects, tombstones. If you walk among the ruins of Greece today, you can still see them. Gravestones carved with reliefs of the dead, seated in calm farewell, holding the hand of a loved one. The scenes are intimate, not violent. They depict not agony, but the stillness of parting, always the gesture of touch, a hand upon a hand, as if to say, I go where you cannot follow, but still, we touch once more. And beneath these images, often a short inscription, sometimes defiant, sometimes pleading, sometimes resigned. Stranger, tell them I lie here. I was, I am not, so live, for you still may, simple words that cut sharper than any philosopher's lecture. In this way, the underworld was woven into daily life. It was not only the myth of Sisyphus, but the empty chair at the hearth, the echo of footsteps never returning, the silence of a field when the ploughman does not rise at dawn. And still, the Greeks found humour in it. They laughed at comedies where shades grumbled about the quality of asphodel. They joked about Charon demanding bribes, about Cerberus wagging his tail too hard and knocking over guests. Perhaps they laughed because laughter itself was an act of defiance against the inevitability of shadow. But there was also reverence, not only for Hades, but for those spirits who hovered between the daimones, the restless dead who could still nudge the living world. These were both feared and honoured, for no one wished to anger the shade of a neighbour, nor ignore the whisper of an ancestor. On certain nights, families would leave offerings outside their homes: honey, bread, a cup of wine, a welcome meal for the wandering dead. And afterward they would sweep the threshold clean to invite the guest to leave politely, because everyone knew the line between the living and the dead was not a wall, but a curtain, one that stirred when the wind of memory passed through. And behind that curtain, always, the underworld waited. Picture it again, the vast plain of asphodel stretching without end, the heroes basking in Elysium, the condemned straining in Tartarus, the furies gliding like storm clouds with eyes of flame, the judges at their stone benches scribbling endlessly with sighs, Persephone's ghostly garden glowing softly in its eternal twilight, Hades on his throne of polished black rock, unshakable, patient, and Cerberus shifting at the gate, loyal as time itself. This was not chaos, but a system, an order in darkness, a reminder to mortals that even death, which seems the wildest of all fates, has its ruler, its boundaries, its laws. And perhaps, deep down, that was the comfort. To know that when the last breath left the lips, one was not falling into a void, but stepping into a land already known by story, already mapped by poets and priests. A land where even silence has a rhythm, where even shadows have a place. And though no mortal longed to hurry there, all understood that one day they would walk those halls, hear the drip of water on stone, and perhaps, if very lucky, catch the faintest wag of Cerberus's tail. And so the tail moves, a single ripple of motion in a world otherwise still, a reminder that in the house of eternity there are still small gestures, still habits, still the faintest signs of life even among the dead. If the underworld had taught mortals one lesson, it was that endings could also be continuities. Every myth, every funeral, every whispered prayer was not a conclusion, but a thread woven into something larger. And as Greek thought matured, the image of Hades' shadowed realm spread beyond its borders, shaping poetry, art, and memory for centuries to come. Let us walk now not with myth alone, but through the painted vases, the carved stones, the plays performed before flickering torches, for there too, Hades and his kingdom appear, sometimes solemn, sometimes comic, but always present. On the red figure craters of Athens, artists trace the outline of Persephone rising, Demeter's arm stretched toward her, Hermes guiding with his caduceus, and there in the background, Hades, dark-robed, often stern, but sometimes depicted with the gentleness that surprises, almost as though even the god of shadows was not immune to the warmth of reunion. Elsewhere, Sisyphus is caught mid-push, muscles straining, his stone eternally rolling back, pain captured not as horror, but as endurance. Viewers at the symposium might sip their wine and point to him, joking lightly about their own tasks in the fields, as though to say, "Well, at least our ploughs stop at sunset." Greek tragedy too could not resist the call of the underworld. In Euripides' plays, ghosts wandered across the stage, not shrieking but speaking, with human grief and longing. They begged for burial. They lamented love. They whispered warnings. For the dead in Greek drama were not distant, but close, always waiting just beyond the skeiny curtain. And comedies. Oh, how they loved to mock the borders of life and death. Aristophanes in his Frogs had Dionysus himself venture below to bring back Euripides, the god of wine descending nervously into Hades, fidgeting at the gates, bargaining with Charon like a customer haggling over olives at the market. It was absurd, but also revealing. For if even Dionysus could tremble before that realm, then laughter itself became a lantern against the dark. The Romans, when they inherited these tales, reshaped them with their own imagination. Hades became Pluto, a figure of wealth, not merely shadow. His realm a treasury beneath the earth, rich with gold and iron. Every coin glinting in the torchlight of the underworld became his property, and so funerary rites in Rome bore coins for Charon, pennies of passage, as though death itself had become an economic transaction. Virgil, in his Aeneid, led Aeneas through the underworld's winding roads, showing him not only the punishments of the wicked, but the unborn souls waiting to rise into history. It was a grand vision, binding Rome's destiny to the cycles of shadow and rebirth. But at the core, the heart of the underworld remained unchanged. It was still Persephone's garden, Hades' throne, the murmuring rivers, and the plain of Asphodel. Think of how strange and how human it is that a people could live with such constant presence of shadow and still celebrate festivals of light and colour, still laugh, still feast, still raise children beneath the same sky that one day would close upon them. Perhaps that is the greatest irony of all, that the Greeks, with all their fear of shade, built lives so dazzling that even today we still speak their names. Achilles, Odysseus, Antigone, Orpheus. They walk through shadow in story so that mortals listening by lamplight could feel less alone in their own thoughts of mortality. And here, at this moment in our wandering, perhaps we too should pause. Imagine the hush of the underworld pressing close around us, the slow drip of water on stone, the scent of earth cold and ancient, the velvet dark wrapping around shoulders like a cloak. In the distance, Sisyphus pushes, Tantalus reaches, the Danaids pour. Orpheus still strums a phantom note, and Hades himself, unmoved, rests upon his throne, patient as centuries, Persephone by his side, her gaze fixed upon a bloom that glows faintly in the gloom. It is easy to think of this as grim, but perhaps it is not. Perhaps there is gentleness in it, a balance, a rhythm. For what is death if not a return to silence, to stillness, after the noisy comedy of life? Listen closely. Do you hear it? The rustle of asphodel flowers in an eternal breeze, the quiet sigh of shades as they drift like moths through twilight, the occasional bark of Cerberus echoing threefold across stone. It is not terror, it is atmosphere. And as we linger here, a final thought emerges, whispered like an echo along the Styx, that the underworld was never truly about death. It was about memory, about what endures after the living step away. For even in Hades' halls, the names of heroes resound, the laments of poets linger, and the laughter of comedies still tickles through shadow. So perhaps, when the Greeks lit their lamps at dusk, told their children stories of Persephone's return, poured their libations for the restless dead, they were not worshipping darkness, but taming it, giving it form and rules, weaving it into the fabric of life so that it would no longer be unknown. And that is the quiet triumph of the underworld, not terror, but understanding, not chaos, but structure, not absence, but the continuation of story. So we leave Hades' realm now, stepping gently back toward the threshold. Cerberus shifts again, his tail thumping softly against the stone, as though to say farewell, not with menace, but with recognition. And as the gates close behind, and the torchlight of the living world glimmers faintly ahead, we carry with us what the Greeks themselves carried, the knowledge that in the end, death is only another kind of journey, another tale, another silence filled with echoes, and in that silence, the flowers still bloom.